The morning sun had barely peeked through the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport's massive windows when Amy Lee hurried through the terminal, her carry-on rolling behind her. Her husband Tom walked beside her, both of them dressed in business casual attire that spoke of the meetings awaiting them in Chicago. It was supposed to be just another business trip, the kind they'd taken dozens of times before. "Gate B7, Tom said, checking his phone while skillfully navigating through the crowd. "We've got about 40 minutes before boarding." He seemed particularly relaxed today, which wasn't unusual for him. As they walked, Amy noticed how he kept glancing at her with that gentle smile of his, the one that had made her fall in love with him 12 years ago. They stopped at a coffee shop, joining the line of sleepy travelers seeking their morning caffeine fix. "I think I'll skip coffee today," Amy said, pressing her hand against her stomach. "Been feeling a bit off since yesterday." Tom raised an eyebrow, but didn't push the matter. That was his way, always observant, never pushy. The Delta Flight 2876 boarding process went smoothly enough. They settled into their seats in row 14, Amy taking the window seat while Tom placed their bags in the overhead compartment. The familiar announcements droned on as the plane prepared for takeoff, and Amy found herself absently flipping through the safety card in the seat pocket. "Remember our first flight together?" she whispered to Tom, trying to distract herself from the slight queasiness she'd been feeling. "That terrible turbulence to Vancouver." Tom chuckled softly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "How could I forget? You practically left fingernail marks in my arm." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a detail Amy had always loved. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into that peculiar rhythm of long flights. The quiet murmur of conversations, the soft ding of call buttons, flight attendants moving up and down the aisle with practiced efficiency. Amy pulled out her tablet, intending to review some presentation slides for their upcoming meeting with potential investors. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Midwest, things began to change. At first, it was just a slight tightness in her chest, the kind you might get from sitting too long in one position. Amy shifted in her seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. But the discomfort didn't ease. Instead, it grew steadily worse. "You okay?" Tom asked, noticing her fidgeting. His voice carried its usual calm, but something about his expression seemed different, almost too composed. "Just feeling a bit." Amy paused, struggling to find the right words. The tightness was becoming more intense, and now she was finding it harder to take deep breaths. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to massage away the discomfort. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." A young boy across the aisle was watching a movie on his iPad, his mother dozing beside him. The flight attendant passed by with her cart, the ice and the drinks clinking softly. Everything seemed so normal, so routine, while Amy felt increasingly that something was very wrong with her body. "Maybe I should say something," she whispered to Tom, not wanting to draw attention. She'd always hated making a fuss, but the pressure in her chest was becoming impossible to ignore. Her breaths were coming shorter now, and she could feel a light sheen of sweat forming on her forehead despite the cabin's cool air. Tom looked at her closely, his expression unreadable. "Let's give it a few more minutes," he said softly. "Sometimes these things pass on their own." His response was puzzling. Usually, he was the first to err on the side of caution. But before Amy could question his unusual reaction, another wave of discomfort washed over her, stronger than before, and she knew this flight was about to become anything but routine. Amy finally worked up the courage to press the call button. Her chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, and the simple act of breathing had become a conscious effort. The soft ding echoed through the cabin, mixing with the ambient hum of the engines. A flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile approached their row. "What can I help you with?" the attendant asked, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing other passengers. Her name tag read Linda. Amy tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She pressed her hand against her chest, and Tom stepped in. "My wife isn't feeling well," he explained, his tone surprisingly measured. "She's having some chest discomfort." Linda's smile never wavered, but her eyes flickered with what looked like mild annoyance. "I see. Would you like some water?" She reached for a plastic cup from her pocket. "It's probably just anxiety from flying. It happens all the time." The dismissal in her voice was subtle but clear. Amy took the water with trembling hands, trying to ignore the burning sensation spreading across her chest. A businessman in the row ahead had turned around, watching the interaction with poorly concealed curiosity. Actually, Amy managed to say between short breaths, "I think it might be more than that. I've never felt anything like this before." She could feel sweat beading on her forehead now, and her fingers had started tingling. Linda tilted her head slightly, her professional demeanor intact but clearly unconvinced. "Have you eaten anything that might have disagreed with you? The altitude can sometimes make indigestion feel worse than it is." Tom sat quietly beside Amy, his face unusually passive. He placed his hand over hers, but said nothing to contradict the flight attendant's assessment. Amy shot him a confused look. This wasn't like him at all. Usually, he was so protective, so quick to take charge in any situation involving her well-being. "Maybe try some deep breaths," Linda suggested, demonstrating with an exaggerated inhale. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Anxiety can make us feel all sorts of physical symptoms." The elderly woman across the aisle looked over sympathetically. "Honey, I get panic attacks too sometimes," she offered kindly. "My doctor taught me to count backwards from 100. Works like a charm." Amy wanted to scream that this wasn't anxiety. She knew what anxiety felt like. This was different, frighteningly different. But the dismissive attitudes around her made her second-guess herself. Was she overreacting? Was this all in her head? Linda handed her a blanket, still wearing that infuriatingly calm smile. "Try to relax. We're still about 2 hours from Chicago. Maybe close your eyes and try to get some rest." The suggestion felt absurd given how much pain she was in, but Amy found herself nodding weakly. The flight attendant moved on to other passengers, leaving Amy wrapped in a thin airplane blanket, fighting against rising panic. "Tom," she whispered, gripping his arm, "why aren't you saying anything? You know I'm not making this up, right?" He turned to her, and for a split second, something flickered across his face. Concern, calculation, or maybe both. "Just try the breathing exercises," he said softly. "Let's get it a few more minutes." A wave of hurt washed over Amy. Even her own husband didn't believe her. She leaned back against the headrest, trying to follow Linda's breathing suggestions, but each breath felt shorter than the last. Through the window, endless clouds rolled by, indifferent to the growing fear that something was seriously wrong with her body. The businessman in front had gone back to his laptop, the elderly woman to her book, and Linda was now cheerfully serving drinks several rows ahead. The normalcy of it all felt surreal against the steadily intensifying pain in Amy's chest. Only Tom's strange calmness suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this situation than met the eye. The next 30 minutes on Delta Flight 2876 felt like an eternity for Amy. The pain in her chest had spread to her left shoulder, and her breathing had become so labored that each intake of air sounded like a quiet wheeze. Her face had lost all color, taking on an alarming grayish tint that didn't go unnoticed by nearby passengers. A young mother in row 15 kept glancing over with growing concern, bouncing her fussy baby while throwing worried looks in Amy's direction. The businessman who had been watching earlier had completely abandoned his laptop now, his forehead creased with worry as he observed Amy's deteriorating condition. "I really think we should call the flight attendant again," the elderly woman across the aisle said, leaning forward. Her earlier advice about counting backward forgotten, as she watched Amy struggle for breath. "Dear, you look absolutely dreadful." Tom checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes, his composure starting to show tiny cracks. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as Amy gripped his arm with trembling fingers. "Just hold on," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. There was something in his voice, not quite worry, but a tension that hadn't been there before. Linda passed by their row again, pushing her cart down the aisle. Her perfectly maintained smile faltered slightly when she saw Amy's condition. Another flight attendant, Robert, joined her, speaking in hushed tones as they both looked at Amy. "Maybe we should check her blood pressure," Robert suggested, but Linda shook her head. "We'd have to make an announcement asking for medical personnel, and that might cause panic," she replied, just loud enough for Amy to hear. "Besides, she was fine half an hour ago. It's probably just hyperventilation." The baby in row 15 started crying, its wails piercing through the cabin's recycled air. Its mother quickly shushed it, but not before shooting an apologetic look at Amy. Somehow, the baby's cries made everything feel more real, more urgent. "I can't," Amy gasped, clutching her chest. "I can't feel my left arm properly anymore." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they carried enough weight to make the businessman turn fully around in his seat. "Look at her lips," he said sharply to the flight attendants. "They're turning blue." A murmur of concern rippled through the nearby rows. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice were now openly staring. Someone a few rows back stood up to get a better look. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from mild concern to genuine alarm. Tom's hand tightened around Amy's, and for the first time, real emotion flickered across his face. He checked his watch again, then pulled out his phone, staring at its blank screen as if making a difficult calculation in his head. "This is ridiculous," the elderly woman announced, standing up despite the seatbelt sign. "That poor woman needs help. I was a nurse for 40 years, and I know what distress looks like." Linda stepped forward, her professional demeanor slightly strained. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We have protocols to follow, and right now, the best thing is to stay calm and—" "Protocols?" The businessman interrupted incredulously. "She can barely breathe. What kind of protocols ignore someone in obvious medical distress?" The baby started crying again, louder this time. Another passenger rang their call button. The tension in the cabin was building like a thundercloud, and even the most disinterested passengers were now watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Through it all, Tom remained eerily calm, though his eyes never left Amy's face. He seemed to be waiting for something, counting down to a moment only he understood. Amy wanted to ask him why he wasn't panicking, why he wasn't demanding help, why he seemed so certain about waiting. But she couldn't find enough air to form the words. The overhead lights suddenly felt too bright, the cabin too warm, the air too thin. Black spots danced at the edges of Amy's vision as she struggled to stay conscious. Something was very wrong with her body, and everyone could see it now. Everyone except the people who were supposed to help. A woman in a navy blazer stood up from her seat near the back of the plane, her silver hair neatly pulled back in a bun. She made her way forward with purpose, ignoring Linda's protests about remaining seated. The woman's movements were decisive, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to handling emergencies. "Excuse me," she announced, loud enough to cut through the growing tension. "I'm Dr. Rose. I've been watching this situation unfold for the past 20 minutes, and I can no longer stay silent." Her voice carried a slight Spanish accent, but her words were crystal clear. The cabin seemed to collectively hold its breath. Linda and Robert exchanged uncertain glances as Dr. Rose approached Amy's row. Tom straightened in his seat, something flickering behind his eyes as he watched the doctor's approach. "How long has she been experiencing symptoms?" Dr. Rose asked, her experienced gaze taking in Amy's blue-tinged lips and labored breathing. She pressed 2 fingers against Amy's wrist, counting silently. "About 45 minutes," the elderly woman across the aisle supplied. It started with chest pain, and it's been getting worse. Dr. Rose's expression darkened. Her pulse is rapid and irregular. She turned to the flight attendants, her tone leaving no room for argument. This woman needs immediate medical attention. I suspect a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lungs. Every minute we delay treatment increases the risk. The businessman who had been watching earlier nodded vigorously. I've been saying something was wrong. Look at her color. This isn't normal anxiety. Linda shifted uncomfortably, her professional smile finally cracking. We have protocols about diverting flights, without absolute certainty. I was the head of cardiology at Greater Valley Hospital for 20 years, Dr. Rose cut in. And I am absolutely certain this woman needs emergency care. Now. The baby in row 15 had finally fallen asleep, but its mother was wide awake, recording everything on her phone. Other passengers had pulled out their phones too, documenting the confrontation. The story was already spreading beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. I've seen too many cases dismissed because people didn't take symptoms seriously. Dr. Rose continued, her voice carrying years of experience and frustration. Women's pain is often ignored or minimized. I'm not letting that happen here. Amy tried to focus on the doctor's face, but her vision was becoming increasingly blurry. She could hear the argument continuing around her, but the voices seemed to be coming from far away. Tom's hand remained steady on hers, his thumb moving in small circles against her palm. The liability issues. Robert began, but Dr. Rose cut him off again. The liability of ignoring a medical emergency would be far worse, she stated firmly. I need access to the plane's medical kit immediately, and the pilot needs to know we require an emergency landing at the nearest airport. A chorus of supportive murmurs rose from the surrounding passengers. The elderly former nurse stood up again, adding her voice to Dr. Rose's. I'll assist you, doctor. This has gone on far too long already. Linda looked desperately at her colleague, then back at the growing crowd of concerned faces. The businessman had already pulled up a map on his phone, calling out possible emergency landing locations. The young mother was still recording, her face set in quiet determination to document everything. Through it all, Tom remained strangely composed, as if watching a play unfold exactly as scripted. He checked his watch one final time, then straightened up, drawing a deep breath. Something in his posture changed, like an actor preparing to step onto stage. Dr. Rose was still arguing with the flight crew about the medical kit when Tom finally moved, and in that moment, everything about him seemed to shift. The calm mask he'd worn for the past hour was about to crack, revealing something none of them had seen coming. The tension in the cabin had reached its breaking point. Dr. Rose stood her ground, demanding the medical kit, while Linda continued citing airline procedures. The other passengers watched the standoff with growing frustration, their phones capturing every moment of the increasingly heated exchange. That's when Tom finally moved. He stood up slowly, his movement drawing all eyes to him. The quiet, seemingly passive husband who had barely spoken during the entire ordeal now commanded attention with just his presence. His face had transformed, showing none of the earlier hesitation. Enough, he said, his voice carrying a new authority that cut through the chaos like a knife. I've seen all I need to see. He turned to face the gathered crowd, his professional demeanor suddenly apparent in every gesture. My name is Dr. Thomas Lee, he announced, pulling an ID badge from his inner jacket pocket. I'm the Chief of Emergency Medicine at Pacific Northwest Medical Center, and this has gone far enough. The cabin fell silent. Linda's mouth dropped open slightly, her perfectly maintained composure finally cracking completely. The young mother with the phone nearly dropped it in surprise. Even Dr. Rose took a small step back, reassessing the situation with new eyes. I've been monitoring my wife's condition carefully, Tom continued, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of controlled anger. I needed to see firsthand how the flight crew would handle a medical emergency without knowing they had a doctor on board. What I've witnessed is, frankly, unacceptable. The businessman who had been watching earlier let out a low whistle. You've been waiting to see how they react, he asked, a mix of admiration and disbelief in his voice. Sometimes the only way to expose flaws in a system is to let them play out, Tom replied, his eyes never leaving Linda's face. But now my wife needs immediate care, and I'm done watching. He turned to Dr. Rose with professional courtesy. Doctor, I'd be grateful for your assistance. Your diagnosis matches my suspicion of a pulmonary embolism. The elderly nurse who had been watching everything unfold nodded vigorously. I knew something wasn't right about your calmness, she said. You were too composed for a worried husband. Robert, the male flight attendant, had turned pale. Sir, if you had told us earlier. That's exactly the point, Tom cut him off firmly. Medical emergencies should be taken seriously regardless of who's involved or what credentials they can present. My wife could have been anyone's wife, and she deserved better care from the moment she first reported symptoms. He turned back to Linda, who was now clutching her hands together nervously. The medical kit. Now. And I want the pilot informed that we have 2 doctors on board confirming the need for an emergency landing. The authority in his voice spurred everyone into action. Linda hurried to retrieve the medical kit, her earlier resistance completely dissolved. Passengers who had been filming quickly shared their videos, the story of the undercover doctor and his wife spreading across social media even before the plane could change course. Amy looked up at her husband through increasingly foggy vision, understanding finally dawning on her face. Despite her discomfort, a small smile tugged at her lips. You were testing them, she managed to whisper. Tom knelt beside her, his professional mask softening as he took her hand. I had to know, he said quietly. But I monitored you every second, love. I would never have let it go too far. He quickly checked her pulse, his trained fingers finding the rhythm he'd been tracking all along. Dr. Rose approached with the newly arrived medical kit, and together, she and Tom began proper treatment. The cabin buzzed with conversation as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. The story of the secret doctor and his dramatic revelation would soon make headlines, but for now, there was a patient who needed care. And finally, she was getting it. The truth about Tom's identity changed everything in the cabin of Flight 2876. As he and Dr. Rose worked together to treat Amy, the other passengers watched in fascination as the full story began to unfold. The businessman who had been so invested in the situation leaned forward in his seat, speaking quietly to the elderly nurse. He had to have been taking her vital signs all along, the nurse said, shaking her head in amazement. Did you notice how he kept holding her hand? He was checking her pulse every few minutes. Tom worked with practiced efficiency, his earlier passive demeanor completely gone. Blood pressure is 90/60, he announced to Dr. Rose, his voice now carrying the clear authority of someone used to running an emergency room. Pulse is 120 and irregular. Linda hovered nearby, her face a mixture of embarrassment and concern. The perfect flight attendant smile was long gone, replaced by genuine worry. I've informed the captain, she said, her voice slightly shaky. We're being diverted to Minneapolis. It's the closest major airport with full emergency medical facilities. The young mother who had been recording everything was now live streaming to her social media followers. You won't believe what's happening on this flight, she whispered into her phone. This doctor pretended to be just a regular passenger to see how the airline would handle an emergency. His own wife was the patient. Tom overheard her and looked up briefly from treating Amy. This wasn't about creating drama or getting attention, he said firmly. This was about exposing a serious flaw in how medical emergencies are handled in the air. I've seen too many stories of passengers being ignored or dismissed until it's almost too late. The businessman nodded thoughtfully. But wasn't it risky? Using your own wife as part of the test. Dr. Rose answered while preparing an injection. He's right to raise these issues. Do you know how many times I've seen patients, especially women, have their symptoms dismissed as anxiety? Sometimes it takes something dramatic to make people pay attention to a broken system. Amy's color was starting to improve slightly with the treatment, though she still struggled for breath. She squeezed Tom's hand, and he squeezed back, his professional mask slipping just enough to show the concern he'd been hiding. "I trust him completely," Amy managed to say between careful breaths. "He would never let anything really bad happen to me." She closed her eyes briefly. "Though we're definitely going to talk about his methods later." A ripple of gentle laughter went through the nearby passengers, breaking some of the tension. The elderly nurse reached across the aisle to pat Amy's arm. "You've got yourself quite a husband there, dear, though I imagine he'll be sleeping on the couch for a while after this." Robert, the male flight attendant, returned with an update from the cockpit. 20 minutes to Minneapolis, he reported, then hesitated before adding, "Dr. Lee, I want to apologize. We should have taken the situation more seriously from the beginning." "That's exactly the point," Tom replied, checking Amy's oxygen levels. "What if I hadn't been here? What if it had been someone else's wife? Every passenger deserves to have their medical concerns taken seriously, regardless of who they are or who they know." The baby in row 15 started fussing again, and its mother bounced it gently while continuing to document everything. The videos were already going viral, with comments pouring in from medical professionals, flight attendants, and passengers sharing similar stories of dismissed symptoms and delayed care. Through it all, Amy watched her husband work, seeing him in a new light. The man she'd married, always so careful and methodical, had orchestrated this entire situation to expose a problem that could save lives. As angry as she was about being part of his test without knowing it, she couldn't help feeling proud too. The plane began its descent into Minneapolis, and the cabin crew prepared for landing. But everyone knew the story was far from over. Tom's revelation and the documentation of the entire incident would spark a conversation that would extend far beyond this single flight. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their emergency descent into Minneapolis. The cabin had transformed into an impromptu medical ward, with Tom and Dr. Rose working together to keep Amy stable. Every bump of turbulence made the passengers hold their breath, watching the medical drama unfold before them. "Oxygen levels are holding steady," Tom reported, his fingers wrapped around Amy's wrist, counting each heartbeat. The calm facade he'd maintained earlier was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a doctor in his element. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" Amy managed a weak smile. "Better. But you're still in trouble," she whispered, making Dr. Rose chuckle as she adjusted the oxygen mask. The young mother in row 15 was still streaming everything live on her phone. "The comments are flooding in," she said quietly to the businessman next to her. "There are doctors and nurses from all over sharing similar stories. This is becoming huge." Linda, the flight attendant who had dismissed Amy's symptoms earlier, approached with fresh blankets. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed them over. "The emergency response team will be waiting at the gate," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I keep thinking about what could have happened if—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "That's the point," the elderly nurse spoke up from across the aisle. "Think about it now. Think about it next time. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call like this to change how we see things." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Tom steadied the medical equipment with practiced ease. The businessman who had been watching everything unfold since the beginning leaned forward. "How did you stay so calm?" he asked. "Watching your own wife in distress, even knowing you could step in." Tom's face grew serious as he checked Amy's vital signs again. 15 years in emergency medicine teaches you to control your emotions," he explained, his voice tight. "But believe me, every minute was harder than the last. I had to keep reminding myself of all the patients I've lost because someone didn't take their early symptoms seriously enough." The baby in row 15 had fallen asleep again, peaceful despite the tension in the cabin. Its mother spoke softly, still recording. "My sister had a heart attack last year," she shared. "The first hospital sent her home, said it was just anxiety. She almost died before someone finally listened." Dr. Rose nodded grimly. Too common a story. That's why what Dr. Lee did here, as unconventional as it was, matters. Sometimes you need to show people rather than just tell them. The plane began its final descent, the pressure change making Amy wince behind her oxygen mask. Tom squeezed her hand, and for a moment, his professional mask slipped completely. "I'm sorry," he whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm sorry I had to do it this way. But you understand why, don't you?" Amy's fingers tightened around his. Even through her discomfort, her eyes showed understanding. The elderly nurse dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, touched by the moment. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, and the passengers collectively tensed. Through the windows, they could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles already waiting on the tarmac. The evening sun cast long shadows across the runway, marking the end of a flight that had become far more than just another journey. 30 seconds to touchdown, Robert announced, making his way through the cabin one last time to check seatbelts. Emergency crews are standing by. Tom did one final check of Amy's vitals, his movements swift and sure. The businessman's phone buzzed continuously with notifications as the videos continued to spread. Linda stood at her station, her face showing the weight of lessons learned the hard way. As the plane's wheels touched down, several passengers broke into spontaneous applause. Not for the landing, but for the medical professionals who had turned a potential tragedy into a powerful lesson. The story of Flight 2876 was about to move from the confines of the aircraft to the national stage, carrying with it questions about medical emergency protocols that could no longer be ignored. The story of Flight 2876 exploded across social media before the plane had even finished taxiing to the gate. The young mother's livestream had already gathered over 50,000 viewers, and clips were being shared across every platform. As paramedics boarded the plane to transport Amy to the hospital, the other passengers found themselves at the center of a viral moment. "Look at these comments," the businessman said, scrolling through his phone. "Medical professionals from everywhere are weighing in. A doctor from Chicago says she had a similar experience last month when trying to help someone on a different airline." The elderly nurse leaned over to read the responses. "The hashtag flight emergency fail is trending," she noted. "People are sharing their own stories of being ignored during medical emergencies. It's like opening a floodgate." Outside the plane's windows, news vans were already pulling up to the terminal. The story had spread from social media to local news stations, and reporters were gathering to catch the passengers as they deplaned. Linda, still visibly shaken by the whole experience, stood near the exit, watching as the paramedics carefully helped Amy onto a stretcher. "The airline's PR team just released a statement," the young mother announced, reading from her phone. "We take all medical emergencies seriously and are conducting a full investigation into the incident. Too little, too late, if you ask me." Tom walked alongside the stretcher, his hand never leaving Amy's. As they passed Linda, he paused. "I hope you understand why I did this," he said quietly. "It wasn't about embarrassing anyone. It was about making sure this never happens again." Linda nodded, tears in her eyes. "I've been flying for 12 years, she replied. "I always thought I was good at handling emergencies. Today showed me I have a lot to learn." The businessman, who had been so invested in the situation from the start, stood up to gather his belongings. "My daughter's in medical school," he shared. "I'm sending her these videos. This is the kind of real-world lesson they need to see." As passengers began to deplane, their phones buzzed constantly with notifications. The story had caught fire, touching a nerve with people who had experienced similar situations. Medical professionals were praising Tom's unconventional approach, while others debated the ethics of his methods. Dr. Lee's actions were bold but necessary, Dr. Rose commented to a gathering of reporters just outside the gate. Sometimes it takes something dramatic to expose flaws in a system. He put his reputation on the line to make a point that needed to be made. The baby from row 15 had woken up, watching the commotion with wide eyes as its mother continued to document everything. "The video has over 1 million views already," she announced. "People are calling it a watershed moment for airline medical protocols." Robert, the male flight attendant, stood with his colleagues, watching the scene unfold. "We're all going to remember this flight for the rest of our careers," he said softly. Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. The elderly nurse stopped to speak with reporters, her years of medical experience lending weight to her words. "In all my years of nursing, I've seen too many cases where people's concerns were dismissed until it was almost too late. Today, someone finally did something about it." As Amy was wheeled through the terminal toward the waiting ambulance, passengers from other flights stopped to record the scene. The businessman overheard someone explaining what had happened, the story already taking on an almost legendary quality. "Did you hear about the doctor who pretended to be just a regular guy?" a stranger asked their companion. "He let his own wife struggle just to prove a point about airline safety. It's either the bravest or craziest thing I've ever heard." By nightfall, every major news outlet had picked up the story. The videos from the flight had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about medical emergency responses, not just on airlines, but in all public spaces. What started as one doctor's dramatic demonstration was quickly becoming a movement for change. 2 weeks after the dramatic events on Flight 2876, the impact continued to ripple through the airline industry and medical community. Amy had made a full recovery at Minneapolis General Hospital, where tests confirmed Dr. Rose's initial diagnosis of a pulmonary embolism. The story had become more than just a viral moment. It had sparked real change. Tom sat in his office at Pacific Northwest Medical Center, looking through the hundreds of emails he'd received since that day. The young mother's livestream had now been viewed over 10 million times, and the hashtag she started had become a movement for change in emergency medical response. Another airline just announced new training protocols, his assistant mentioned, bringing in the morning's reports. That's the third one this week. They're all updating their medical emergency procedures. The businessman from the flight had kept in touch, sharing how the video had become required viewing in his daughter's medical ethics class. "They're using it as a case study," he'd written, about when breaking protocol might be necessary to expose systemic problems. In the hospital cafeteria, Amy sat with Dr. Rose, who had extended her stay in the city to help advocate for change. The airline CEO called again. Amy said, stirring her coffee. "They want Tom to help develop their new emergency response training program." "Good," Dr. Rose replied firmly. "They need someone who understands both sides, the medical urgency and the airline procedures. Your husband, as unconventional as his methods were, might be exactly what they need." The elderly nurse had appeared on several morning shows, her straightforward manner and years of experience lending credibility to the cause. "It's not just about airlines," she'd explained to millions of viewers. "It's about taking every medical complaint seriously, no matter who the patient is or what credentials they can show." Linda, the flight attendant, had written a powerful blog post about the experience that went viral in its own right. "I thought I knew what a medical emergency looked like," she'd written. "That day taught me that sometimes the quietest calls for help are the most urgent. We can't let procedures blind us to human suffering." The baby from row 15 had become a minor social media star, its mother's documentation of the event leading to appearances on news programs discussing passenger rights and medical emergency responses. "My inbox is full of similar stories," she shared during one interview. People who weren't taken seriously until it was almost too late. Back at their home, Tom and Amy sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. The events of that flight had changed their relationship too. "I'm still mad at you," Amy said, but there was no anger in her voice anymore. "But I understand why you did it. Just, maybe warn me next time you plan to start a medical revolution. Tom squeezed her hand, feeling her strong, steady pulse, so different from that frightening day on the plane. No more secret tests, he promised. But look at what's happening now. 3 major airlines have completely overhauled their training. They're adding medical equipment to every flight. They're listening. The airline industry had indeed taken notice. New guidelines were being implemented across multiple carriers. Flight crews were receiving enhanced medical response training. Emergency medical kits were being upgraded. The story of Flight 2876 had become a turning point. Robert, the male flight attendant, had been promoted to lead a new medical response training program. We learn from our mistakes, he told a room full of trainees, showing clips from that fateful flight. We learn, we change, and we do better. The businessman's daughter had written her medical ethics paper about the incident. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from real-life examples, she'd concluded. Dr. Lee's actions that day might have seemed extreme, but they saved more than just his wife's life. They might have saved countless future passengers. As evening fell, Amy's phone buzzed with another message from the young mother. The latest video about airline medical response changes had gone viral. Look what you started, Amy told her husband, showing him the thousands of supportive comments. Tom smiled, remembering the tense moments on that flight. No, he corrected gently. Look what we all started together. Sometimes it takes a village to change the world, or at least to make the skies a little safer for everyone.